Welcome back to the Builder's Bench. I'm Craig Larkins. Joining me on the bench this week, we have Louis-Philippe Champagne from Toronto from the Canadian Construction Association and Sajjid Lakhani from Impact Public Affairs. Welcome back to the bench.
Nice to see you.
The big story this week, Prime Minister Carney heading south of the border to meet with the Prime Minister. We're talking supply chains, we're talking tariffs. LP, what's your take on the visit?
Yeah, indeed. A big day yesterday for Mark Carney and his entire administration. Back into Washington, back in the White House in this slightly awkward situation, sitting across the president, not too sure what he's going to say. If he's going to complain about the quality of your suit. But turns out the meeting was fairly positive, I would say. Of course, as positive as it can get in the middle of a trade war with the other nation. But Mark Carney putting himself in a fairly friendly position with Donald Trump. Donald Trump making some very interesting positive comment toward Mark Carney himself, saying that he's a great friend and a good guy, and he's happy to have him there. So that took a number of people by surprise, me included. But definitely a good start for that new phase of discussion on the tariff. You know, for most people in Canada, we're looking at the tariff, trade war, trade dispute situation as one continuum since the election of Donald Trump. But there's really a transition that we've seen in recent weeks and months when Canada decided to remove some of their tariff as a show of good faith, and now dealing with some pain point. As Mark Carney pointed it tomorrow, this is where Canada and the U.S. tend to be in competition with one another, not necessarily enemies, right? But this is the path forward to the negotiation for next year in the North American Trade Agreement, now CUSMA. And this is an important turning point, both for the Carney administration, for the Canadian economy, and of course for Donald Trump, who himself says he wants to be a great guy, just like Mark Carney. So we'll see if that pays off. Maybe I'll start about... Yeah,
there definitely was more of a friendlier tone, I will say, in watching.
It was interesting. I mean, to be fair, Trump always had a fairly positive tone toward Mark Carney. And I mentioned this on a previous podcast. I think it's easy for us to forget what these men are before politics, right? Trump, we now have this very specific picture as Canadians, specifically of Donald Trump being this aggressive, sometimes irrational president. But really, at the end of the day, he is a billionaire from New York. And Mark Carney is a man that has very strong business connection in New York City as well. So their close circle of colleagues and friends mostly have interlaps. And I'm sure that is a big part of the collaboration they see there. Anyway, long story short, I think what people care the most about on this podcast is what that means for us in construction. And it is an important topic. I can't emphasize enough how the supply chain disruption we've seen over the past few years, and especially the last few months, are significant for construction. We have been through the COVID pandemic, the very sharp recovery, the container crisis, and now a full year almost of U.S. tariff. And this is putting significant strain on our supply chain. I was just in Ottawa on Thursday last week meeting with senior officials from the government, presenting to them on the state of our supply chain. And the key concern we see is that if you look at economic indicators such as the BCPI, the Building Construction Price Index, what is very apparent is that the price of construction have exploded over the last few years. Any construction company listening will know anecdotally by seeing the quote they receive and the timeline they have on these quotes that building is more and more expensive. And it is a challenge for a contractor to guarantee price and to make sure they keep project under proper guidelines. When we see policies like we've seen in the last few years, whether they are counter tariff, whether they are anti-dumping tariff on countries that are not the United States, or more recently, discussion that have been taking place on Buy Canadian policy, making sure that our product comes from Canada. This is further pressure on that supply chain. This is the government intervening in the natural forces of market and creating this false contraction of the supply where price goes up. Now, why does that matter? Well, there's two things. First, we want to be sure, and that's our work at the CCA, that contractors are not stuck with the bill. And in our discussion with Ottawa, especially around Buy Canadians, we've made sure throughout the process that this is not retroactive. This doesn't apply to current project. Because then if you've signed a contract years ago and suddenly they change the rule, this is just not fair. And they should at least cover the burden of these rules if they choose so. I can't really go in details of the policy because it's not released yet, but we've been involved in discussion. I must give credit to government. They have been listening to CCA and remove some of the hurdle we were seeing in the policy. I believe this will be released in the coming weeks, so something of discussion for the future. But that says the opposite of that is if the contractor don't get the bill, who pays for this increase in price? Well, of course, it's the taxpayer. And our great concern in that regard is if taxpayers pay more for every road project, every building, every military base, then what happens? Well, we have less money in the pocket for new project. And this is an issue for contractor because we are currently struggling, and we've been struggling for a while with workforce. And as we try to protect that workforce, make sure we don't cut our workers, we need to have a steady pipeline of project. If suddenly that pipeline of 5 project for elementary schools or overpass is contracted to 4 or 3 because the overall budget can no longer meet the increase in price, this is a problem not just for the economy but for our industry.
And Rod Jabber, the president of the CCA, just did a great article in the Hill Times. If you haven't had an opportunity to check it out, he breaks that all down in a very to the point way, as I like to say. So, in other words, LP, you're saying we have some good news on the horizon as far as Buy Canadian policy and working with the government and such. Okay, that's good to hear. Sajjid, did you want to weigh in on that? I mean, we're talking about the acronym CUSMA, the Carney agenda. Where's your head at?
Yeah, LP covered most of it quite well, but it's also interesting to note for our industry that based on yesterday's meetings, the president and prime minister seem to have assigned Secretary Lutnick and Minister LeBlanc to at least, tackle the tariffs related to steel and aluminum. Unfortunately, auto was still, not left in the best position, even though the president joked that, we want Canada's industry to do well, but we want ours to do better. But when he says that, at least there is a line in the sand to understand the negotiations with this administration. They want U.S. to succeed, not necessarily at the expense of Canada, it seems from yesterday's discussions, but it's just a stark realization that they want their economy to do really well. And of course, that is a primary objective and responsibility for any world leader. But it's good to see that there may be some movement on the steel and aluminum front now that it's been more focused between the trade secretary and commerce secretary there, as well as Minister LeBlanc. But in terms of supply chain management, we're going to face this issue even more so coming forward with, frankly, a contracting economy and a softening of labor markets, and it's all interrelated. And just got to make sure that we have the right policies to address that.
So I wanted to bring it back home, back to Ottawa, back to Canada, in regards to Prime Minister Carney's agenda. We've had a lot of, I say it's the season of acronyms coming out recently. We have the Major Projects Office, MPO. We have Building Canada Homes, BCH. We have the Defense Investment Agency, DIA. Lots of offices being opened, lots of offices being staffed. When does the rubber hit the road? When do we actually start to see some action, and how's that going to impact industry?
That's a tough question. And you're right. We have plenty of acronyms recently.
So many acronyms.
And there's more coming this fall. I think we're very hopeful to see the NIA coming into force very soon. So all of this is happening at full swing. It's been a busy 6 months. Really, it started with, of course, the result of the election, the new government coming in. They had a very busy few weeks right before the House left in the summer in June. We remember, of course, Bill C-5, amongst other things, that was significant for us. And now what we're seeing is Mark Carney and his administration coming back in the House for their first full session of Parliament, having a chance to really take a dent into the challenge we're facing in terms of housing affordability or trade disputes. And the way they've designed this is over the summer, they had significant consultation with industry and stakeholder. We were a bit overwhelmed, to be honest, in July and August, the number of documents we had to produce for them on Build Canada Home, on MPO, on Buy Canadians. And now we're in this phase of announcements. So as you pointed out, September 11 was the first big one, as I can remember it, which was the MPO, the Major Project Office. This is this announcement correlated to the Bill C-5, which says we're going to streamline project, announcing 5 shortlist projects, which are projects that are fairly advanced in terms of their procurements and planification. This is 2 in BC, 1 in Quebec, 1 in Ontario, and 1 in Saskatchewan. Good project, ready to go, hitting the road very soon, hopefully. But then more importantly, this is a subset of future projects that the MPO will consider for the next phase of prioritization. And some of them are quite interesting in terms of our request at CCA on trade infrastructure. So we see some trade corridor in the Arctic, Port of Churchill, the high-speed rail between Toronto and Quebec City, right? Some of that infrastructure we've been requesting for quite a long time. So when the rubber hit the road is a big question, though, right? It's still in development. They now have a CEO. They're ready to go. But when will approval actually go forward? When will project actually hit the ground? This is the big unknown. It could be very soon. Could be the end of the fall. Nobody knows.
We are at the waiting game point.
We sure are. Yeah. And that's for the MPO. If you look at Build Canada Home, the situation is a bit worse. This was announced just 3 days later on September 14. This is this new agency that Carney has announced in their election campaign, something that CCA in the industry is fairly reserved on. We don't believe it is necessarily the best investments of fund. This is significant dollar. Right now, the announcement was, I believe, for $13 billion in initial funding. The overall budget in the election was promised to be $36 billion. This is a big chunk of taxpayer dollar for an agency who really have 2 mandates, 3 maybe. Affordable housing, not housing affordability. So this is housing of reduced value, modular construction promotion, and then effectively being a developer, a public developer for housing, which we don't believe is necessarily the bottleneck for construction. There's plenty of public developer ready to build. The reason why they are not building is the improper risk balance, the availability of workforce to do so, and more importantly, the lack of municipal infrastructure. There's plenty of projects ready to go in region across Canada that cannot move forward because of the lack of permitting due to moratorium, because of the lack of wastewater, for example. This is the case in Lévis, Quebec, for example. Thousands of doors ready to be built, but can't be done because the city says we're at capacity. We need to invest in a new treatment plant or sewer system. And as long as we don't fix that issue with municipal funding for infrastructure, we won't be able to prevent situation like we've had in Calgary last summer or to build more homes. And this is, I think, what the federal government could have been doing with their funding. And they are effectively looking at other solutions. But I'm not quite sure yet if Build Canada Home will ever hit the road in the way we are hoping to see it happening.
It's very much the cart before the horse scenario when you, I mean, it's great to see the focus on construction, but there's other factors like you're saying, skilled labor, we have infrastructure investments. So it's interesting to see how this will play out. I did want to touch on something, localize it, Sajjid. They announced 4,000 modular homes on federal land across the country. BC was left off that list. How should we take that? How should we as British Columbians interpret that? How should members and builders interpret that?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that the minister is from BC. Yeah, we didn't have any projects in our province. However, I think that's the reality when you look at Build Canada Homes too. The federal lands and to tackle that in BC, our hub is the Lower Mainland, not necessarily in a federal land space. And our problems are very different from what the problems in Canada Build Homes are really addressing. They're more towards the problems that LP just mentioned in terms of working with the municipalities and cutting red tape around permitting. Craig, we've joked about this quite a bit. Other jurisdictions like Calgary, where our friend Ferrano works, one municipality, that's the show. Right here, it's 21 plus a Metro Vancouver board. That's the bureaucracy, perhaps, that the federal government could have took leadership in. And LP, I've heard it's up to $40 billion now in terms of the evaluation they're going to invest in Build Canada Homes, and we're just not too sure if modular is the way to go. So I think British Columbians shouldn't be too offended because this program is not necessarily just for us, but it's also perhaps not the best way to tackle the issues of development and red tape and the supply issue here. Yeah. But Craig, just want to tie it a bit back to what you asked earlier about CUSMA and the whole government agenda. The negotiations leading to next year's CUSMA redrafting in July 2026. That's the telling point for the Prime Minister and this government. The banks have verified this, and while Liberal government was using it as a talking point of 85 to 90% of our goods being covered under CUSMA, of course, steel, aluminum, big sector, major materials for our sector, not a part of that. But if any of those products that are already covered by the current version of CUSMA are not by the next one, that's when the government's going to have a real issue. And in terms of the major project office, LP hit the nail on the head. This is assigned to Western Canada. This is assigned to the resource sector. This is assigned to our industry, that this government is, back on track in terms of taking it seriously. And while, more offices can build bureaucracy, that's a very valid point that the official opposition leaders made. This was necessary to, reestablish confidence in the private sector, and hiring someone like the former CEO of Trans Mountain just shows that and builds some confidence, especially in Alberta. And that's what we need right now in terms of private sector relationship.
I've actually heard coming from the opposition, it's the Maybe Projects Office as a new acronym for us. Could we just quickly touch
Craig.
down? Yeah, sorry, LV.
Yeah, there's a couple more acronyms I'd like to touch on before we move on. One of them is NIA, and you've heard me tell you a lot about the NIA before. This is something that CC have been advocating for a long time. Now, we know earlier this year, the government announced the CIC, the Canadian Infrastructure Council, I'm even lost with my own acronym, who are now looking into developing their very first NIA. And I mentioned that because this speaks directly to what we just mentioned, this need for municipal investment infrastructure. So they have been tasked with the minister to look for the first phase of the NIA, to look specifically at housing infrastructure. And we are very hopeful to see an NIA, a formal NIA, being finally released for Canada this fall, that we hope will be speaking these talking point and these key important issue that we have with municipal infrastructure. So I would say let's stay tuned over the course of the fall. I believe something good is coming this way. The other thing you mentioned, the defense procurement agency. This is brand new. We learned about it on Thursday. I was in a room in Ottawa with the National Defense Representative and DCC, Defense Construction Canada, who were learning as we were about the new agency. A lot of question remains on what goes in there, but my reading of it is the government want to streamline how defense procurement is very unique in this new agency. I believe and I hope that Defense Construction Canada would remain in their current situation because they have been an amazing partner for the construction sector. They are engaged with the industry. They are one of the Canadian landmark in terms of modern delivery model. So whether they are brought into the agency or underneath it or parallel to it, we are looking forward to keep working with DCC in that regard. But one thing is sure, defense investment are ramping up very quickly. When we say that the government want to meet their 2% NATO target, maybe exceed it, this is many, many billions of dollars that goes into, yes, purchasing new aircraft and submarine and frigates, but into investment in our infrastructure, in our bases, in our airports, in military bases, of course. And as we expand up north and look at our mission in the north, making sure we protect Canadian sovereignty, there's immense potential there for construction project. And I'm confident over the next few years, we'll see a great impact from that announcement from earlier this year.
And I think that that's part of the conversation. A lot of people confuse when you say defense spending, it's just tanks, planes, but it's actually buildings and infrastructure, and that's how it relates to industry. So definitely pay attention to those announcements. Sajjid, can you just break down what CUSMA means again, just in case that acronym, in case some listeners don't know?
Absolutely. You know, each country involved actually rearranges the acronym, but since we're obviously proud Canadians, it's a Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, and that's formerly known as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that was signed during the Mulroney era, and yeah, with that, of course, it regulates a lot of our trade with our partners, and it's been a stable set of frameworks to build our trade relationship and to manage that. So if any of the products that are already covered right now change, that'll be seen as quite a big loss for the Prime Minister. But it's interesting what LP also mentioned about this new defense spending specific office and sector in that aspect where, like you said, Craig, it's more than just tanks and planes, and that this provides a real opportunity for our industry to be involved in defense where we have more accountability than ever now. During the Trudeau years, we were able to push back our NATO commitment, but it's gotten to a point where we had to face our partners in that alliance as there's more global instability and tell them that we're going to meet our commitments. And, it's a bit easier not to fall through your domestic commitments, but it's much more difficult internationally when you have other nation states making you accountable and then questioning your role in the international community. So I think this just provides more opportunity for our industry to be involved and be a part of these projects.
Lots of moving parts, lots of really cool initiatives, cool policy, lots of offices opening, and it all relates to construction. So, of course, we'll continue to follow that conversation. I think the big next spotlight that I want to put on is the budget, which is a whole other podcast, Elfie, that we can schedule for a later date. You can find past episodes of The Builder's Bench on VRCA's website. Of course, stay tuned. Session has resumed, both provincially and nationally. So, Louis-Philippe Champagne is based out of Toronto. He's with the Canadian Construction Association. And Sajjid, you're based right here in Vancouver, most times, right?
Yep.
Director at Impact Public Affairs. I'm Craig Larkins, and this is The Builder's Bench.